Okay, welcome back to a special episode of Midnight Frequency Radio with Carl Richardson. I'm your host, Dr. J from Dr. J Radio Live, filling in for Carl today. Today with me, I have a very, very special guest, someone who I've interviewed on my own show, who I thought you guys need to hear. We're talking about the Pascagoula event. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest, the one and only Dr. Irena Scott. Dr. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And if you recall, the last time we did it on my channel, it wasn't enough time because there's so much information you have in your book. And I guarantee at the end of this hour, people who are listening are going to be asking for more. Let's go back in time. Were you already a believer in UFOs, or did something happen that made you realize something's going on?
Well, something happened to me before I ever heard of UFOs when I was just practically a baby. My sister and I were sleeping in an upstairs bedroom. We were really poor and didn't have TVs or anything. We'd never heard of UFOs, but we had this thing flying around inside our bedroom, and we both saw it and watched it, and it flew around, and it seemed to be guided. It didn't run into anything. And then it flew up to the ceiling and flew around the ceiling, and then it circled a chandelier and came under it. And suddenly we both became terrified and ran out of the room and ran to our parents, and they told us we imagined it. There were two of us, and we weren't even talking to each other, so we didn't imagine it. And then I found out years later that could have been a UFO. And then my sister and I had another sighting, had some other sightings also, but back then you didn't talk about it.
Well, yeah, the ridicule factor actually still existed even 10 years ago, in my opinion. It wasn't until the New York Times 2017 article when they talked about ATIP that really things started to change. At least that's what I think the big shift was. Now, you went off to, you got a Ph.D., obviously, you taught at university, but more importantly, you also worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency. There was some incident there that exposed you to more UFOs, right?
Yes, there was. I was working in air order of battle at the time, and what we did, it was very classified work. We identified aircraft from the Spy in the Sky satellites, and they go around about every 90 minutes. And my supervisors told me that they'd found a UFO, and they reported it as a UFO. And I saw it too. It was on two different films. And what was really weird is that their supervisors, I mean, I had my supervisor, I think was a GS-14 or something, was high in the government. And their supervisors told them that it didn't exist and it was a spot on the film. And they were, professionals and knew what they were doing and everything. They couldn't believe that their supervisors told them it was nothing.
Do you think the supervisor was told by someone to say that it was nothing, just a spot, or do you think that was just him trying to protect the mission and not bring this UFO into this?
Well, it was all classified, so it wouldn't get out anyplace anyway. But I thought either their supervisors were very incompetent and didn't know a thing about analyzing photographs, or else they were lying. And it caused me to be suspicious that high up in the government, some people knew about UFOs.
Now, at what point did you get involved investigating Pascagoula? Because you were one of the last people to interview Calvin Parker, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I got involved in it because something happened to me the same time as the abduction. I was in Missouri at the time, and my mother was in Ohio. I don't know if I told you this or not. Did I?
Yeah, but for this audience, we definitely should talk about it. You were 600 miles away. It was a phone call, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, I was 600 miles away, and my mother called and said she heard an explosion, and Dad and her were real concerned about it. And I kept telling her I couldn't hear it. I was 600 miles away and 3 states away. And she just kept insisting, "Did you hear it?" And so I started kidding her, and she'd always said that if she showed dementia, we should tell her. And so I started telling her she was crazy and everything, and laying it on. But she took it, but she still kept asking, "Did you hear that noise?" And I thought that was a really strange thing. And years later, I was in Ohio, and I was just in the library, and the Ohio State University library, and they had actual newspapers for a while in their library. And I on impulse, I wondered if I could find when that sound was. And so I went in, and I didn't know when it was or anything else. I just made a guess and started looking through newspapers, and I actually found it. And it was so odd because it was heard over a real wide area, and it was never identified. And I started investigating and wrote it up, and the state seismologist of Ohio helped me with it and put it in a scientific journal that there was a strange sound heard for a very long distance, and nobody ever identified what caused it. But the sound was exactly just about as new as you could guess, the same time as the abduction. And I wasn't interested in the abduction at all, but I had paid attention to the sound. And then many years later, I had a book accepted by Flying Disc Press by Philip Mantle. And Philip Mantle was developing a real high interest in Pascagoula. And so he's in England, where they have an English accent. And Calvin was down in Mississippi, where they have an accent.
Southern, yeah.
And he asked me to interview people. And so I was really interested because I already had investigated the sound, but I'd never paid attention to the abduction until then. And so I started paying attention to the abduction too.
One thing that really stood out after I interviewed you, actually it hit me when I was interviewing the first time and also going through your book, is it's almost like fate brought you to Pascagoula, because it wasn't just what happened when you were young with your sister in the room, and it wasn't just that phone call. There were more synchronicities that linked you to Pascagoula, right?
Yeah, actually, the very first thing I ever wrote about UFOs was about the sound, and that I was in science, so I didn't go around talking about UFOs. But anyway, I gave this, it was a scientific paper, but the people in Ohio found out about the paper and wanted me to give a talk on UFOs. And so, well, actually, the first thing I'd ever written about UFOs was for an English professor. It was for an English class. And then people had found out about that I'd done the study, and they asked me to give a talk to a UFO group. And that way I met people in UFOs from Ohio. So actually, Pascagoula figured in my life because it was the first thing I ever wrote about UFOs. And then it's what actually brought me into meeting UFO people and eventually joining UFO groups and things like that.
There's a couple people I know that some prominent ufology figures that I've interviewed, and these are just some of the people you've also worked with: Whitley Strieber, Robert Salas, Stanton Friedman, and many more. Who would you say was the biggest influence in your ufology career and writing and investigating?
Oh, I think probably the local group here, because I didn't want to talk about UFOs because of being in scientific work, but the people here that belonged to the UFO group pulled me in, and I started doing investigating with them and finding out more about how to investigate UFOs. And then MUFON also was a big influence.
You were on the board for MUFON or something like that, right?
Yes, I was. I was on the board of directors for a while.
Now, this is another thing that blew me away when I first interviewed you, because I've been interested in Pascagoula for years. I've only spoken to Calvin Parker in that one interview, may you rest in peace. But I'd never known there were more than him and Charles Hickson? What's his last name?
Yeah, Charles Hickson.
Yeah, I did not know more than the two of them were taken that very same day. Can you talk about, because you've interviewed well over 50 eyewitnesses in Pascagoula that saw something, or at least one other person was taken that same day or night?
Well, actually, I think there were about 100 people that reported sightings overall, which is just absolutely amazing, because something was really strange in the sky that night. And I found out later there were a lot of weird things happening all over the country at the same time too. Calvin had been on YouTube giving a talk, and there were a lot of comments, and one of the comments was this woman said, yeah, my mother watched the abduction. Well, my parents watched the abduction. Philip Mantle, who just is a really good researcher, jumped on that and found out who the woman's parents were and gave me them to interview. And so I called him to interview him. And the husband was a skeptic, and he just said something like, I heard a splash or something. But his wife said that they were by a pier with a ship on the end of it, and it was right across the river from where the abduction took place. And they didn't know it was the abduction going on at the time. What they were doing was his supervisor was going to come, and he and the supervisor were going out on the ship to provision some rigs and things. But the supervisor was late, and so he went to sleep in the car, and she was looking around, and she saw this thing flying around, and she couldn't figure out what it was. She kept saying that this is a airplane, but the pilot's lost or confused or something. It just kept flying around, and she didn't understand it. Then she said that her husband decided to take his clothes to the ship. And it was about 9:00, and they walked down the pier, and he was ahead of her, and something jumped up right in front of her on the pier, and it looked like a person. And I asked her if it was a fish, it was a dolphin, and she said no, it looked just like a person. But then it flopped back and never came up for air, and she was terrified. They went to the ship, and then she said at 12:00 she was coming back, and that caused bells to ring in my head for two things. One is that she was so terrified of whatever jumped up on the pier, and the other thing was there seemed to be missing time, because there seemed to be 3 hours that just disappeared. And so I stayed in contact with her. She was the first person I interviewed, and I didn't even know there were other witnesses then. And so I stayed in contact with her. And several years later, her husband, the skeptic, became very ill and went on a ventilator, which means you can't talk. Well, before he went on the ventilator, he told her that they had been abducted, and that he had previous contact with the entities or whatever they were in the abduction. And so, it was pretty strange for her, because not only did she hear she was abducted, but this is from her own husband, who seemed to be in contact with the entities. And so then later, under hypnosis, she remembered a little more, but she had no idea she'd been abducted until then. But her husband apparently knew about it, but he always had positioned himself as a skeptic.
I thought that's a little ironic when you first told me that too. So outwardly, he was telling everybody, including his wife, hey, there's nothing here, I don't believe it. But literally right before he goes on the ventilator, does he not only say, hey, honey, we've been taken, but also says he was in contact prior to that, right?
Yes.
Before we jump into the nuts and bolts of what happened to Calvin and Charles, because you mentioned missing time, and this is something I absolutely credit you for, that I hope the rest of the community does. When I interviewed Lou Elizondo a few years ago, and famously he talks about this now, he also put this in his book, The Observables of UAPs. You created a list of observables for abductees, right?
Uh-huh.
Can we talk about that, those observables? Because missing time is a massive one.
Yes. Yes, we can. I'm looking for my list.
No problem. In the meantime, I will say one of them, I believe, is paralysis, right? Inability to control your own body. Those are the two, obviously, I remember.
One of them that I thought really drew my attention was that I just listed things that seem to be in common with the abductions, from a number of abductions. And one of them, a lot of abductions started with people seeing light, strange light or a light or something like that. And that was the first one I listed. It seemed to be the first thing that happened to people.
And then, of course, I'm assuming usually following the light is when they get paralyzed, I would imagine.
Yes, paralysis is definitely, or generally, accompanies abduction.
And then, of course, the first one that you mentioned, missing time, with that woman who had the 3 hours missing. Any more off the top of your head that you want to jump into, or no?
Just a minute. I actually have a list of them. Just a second.
Sure. Well, while you're looking for that, let me ask you this, because when we get into the nuts and bolts of what happened to Charles and Calvin, one of the things that always stood out to me and why it was one of my favorite cases, aside from the fact of the police tape that we'll talk about after, was the types of beings. They were so unique looking. So we'll get to that in a second, but let me know if you have that list. Otherwise, the question I was going to ask was, that woman that had the 3 hours missing time that was also taken, that the husband, before he went on the ventilator, said that, hey, we were abducted and I've had contact. What types of beings were those that abducted them? They weren't the same that took Calvin and Charles, right?
They might have been the same. I thought that this was so stressful that people might not even remember things. He described them as taller. There were different descriptions. They weren't like Charles and Calvin didn't describe them the typical way. Today, a lot of aliens are sort of shown as skinny little things, short with big heads and big eyes. And
Grace, essentially.
Yes, but like usually the aliens are skinny and things like that. But their abductors were kind of porky, kind of had maybe fat or something, and had wrinkly skin and no eyes, or they couldn't see the eyes. So they were a lot different and they had on their heads where you have projections in humans, where they had like ears and a nose, where they had sort of like little carrots or something for projections instead of ears and a nose.
And their hands were claws too, right?
Yes, their hands were claws.
Now, might as well jump into, since we talked about the beings that Calvin and Charles saw. So I believe they were dock workers, correct me if I'm wrong, or no?
No, they worked for a shipbuilding company.
Okay.
And I think Charles was a supervisor, and he just hired Calvin. And Calvin, I think, was in welding.
And he was 17 at the time.
He was 18.
Oh,
he was
18.
a teenager.
Yeah, very young. Now, so they went fishing, and was it about midnight when they started to see the light?
Oh no,
It was earlier.
They didn't have watches, but it was earlier than that. It was after dark. It was in October. I'm sorry, but it was after dark, but just after dark, I think. They didn't know for sure.
This is around the time the other witnesses, like the crane operator or the other person that you mentioned, saw this craft that they thought the pilot was not in the right mind because they were flying around and not so normal. Essentially, this craft came not far off them, but it didn't land, or did it land? Was it just floating off the water near where they were fishing?
Yeah, that's people keep criticizing it and say, well, it's the government, but this object, it didn't it wasn't in the water. It wasn't on land. It floated up to him. It was levitated.
And not just that, when the beings came out, their feet were not touching the ground. They were also levitating towards Charles and Calvin. Am I correct?
And then when they grabbed Charles and Calvin, they levitated them into the whatever it was.
Now, for most people who don't recall other aspects out of that abduction, as far as the memories, or unless they had hypnosis down the line, what happened once they got in that they remembered that they told you? Or did you never have a chance to speak to Charles? Obviously, I didn't. He passed away a long time ago.
No, I just read their books. What they both reported in common was that they were taken inside, and they thought they were reclined on a table, but they may have just been levitated lengthwise. And they both reported that something appeared to scan them. Charles said it looked like a big eye that just came out from the wall. It was so bright they couldn't see anything on the inside, but this big eye type thing came out of the wall and then went around him. And the same as Calvin, he said it was something like a deck of cards. Today you might say like a iPhone or something. Something came out and appeared to scan him. They both reported that.
Also, I recall from your book, a female possibly wearing a mask or something that Calvin saw, which is different than the types of beings with the claws and the carrot-looking things that were sticking out of where their ears would be. Can you talk about that being, the female?
Yeah, he didn't report that. I mean, he didn't talk about any of it for about 50 years, but he underwent hypnosis later, and I guess he actually remembered this, but he didn't talk about it. There was a female aboard, and she looked kind of human, but he knew she wasn't human, although he said she was rather attractive, actually. And she gave him visions of like the future, of like the end of the world and things like that. And it was kind of like a near-death experience, too. He saw her on board, and then he saw her another time later for another abduction.
That actually was another breakthrough that I had not known about until I interviewed you, that there was a follow-up abduction with Calvin. And if you recall, I told you this last time, when I interviewed him. Obviously, we only had a certain amount of time, and we were supposed to do it again, but sadly he passed away. He told me that there was stuff that he was shown or told that he would tell me at another point later. And now, after I interviewed you and went through your book, I realized what it was the stuff about wars and Earth ending. Can you go into detail of any of that you heard? I believe it was from his regression tape, or he told you himself as well.
Yes, it was from his regression. He had several regressions, and he said that there would be disease, and he didn't know if the disease was a COVID or not. I
was just going to say COVID came out, and that's the one that we created, and who knows what else is being, created now in the gain of function research.
And then after that, there might be a terrible war, such that flesh melts off people's bones and things. And then eventually that things straighten out and get better.
When this actually happened, it was already a tumultuous time, not just in the United States, but the entire world. In 1973, for those people who don't know the year this took place, the Yom Kippur War was going on, Watergate, the nuclear brinkmanship of the era. We were literally at odds with the Soviet Union at the time. That was probably some of the scariest times. Do you think that had something to do why they came then? Because the world was literally on the brink of nuclear war?
Well, it was amazing. I was just thinking today, there was a lot of UFO activity, not only where they were, but all over the country. And if you went into detail about any place, I mean, like my mother, when she called me a few days later and said it was like a war zone, that people were hiding in their basements and keeping their kids in and staying in at nights and things. And it was like a war zone with the UFOs. And several other I mean, in other places too, if you went into detail at that, around that time, there was a whole lot going on all over the country. But I mean, they had DEFCON 3 alert, which means that nuclear war is just about ready to happen.
DEFCON 4 is war breaks out, right? Defense Condition 3 is like be ready to launch, essentially, right?
Yeah. And that had been on the radio. They announced DEFCON 3. And they had the big scandals of like Nixon and Watergate and all that, plus a Israel war and the oil and gas crisis and everything else. And in one of my talks, I compared it to now, because the UFOs are making the news now. We're having an Israel war. There's been talk of nuclear, using nukes, and there still is.
Same thing in Russia. They've been talking about using tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war.
Yes. And so it's like 50 years later, the same thing happens, plus all the scandals in Washington, too.
Before we take a quick break, I did want to also ask you about the Coast Guard. They saw a USO, which essentially is a UFO that's underwater. Am I mistaken?
You're right.
And was this at the same time Calvin and Charles were taken, or was it prior or after? It was the same night, right?
No, it was theirs was the 11th of October, and the USO was the 6th of November, so it was just about 3 weeks later, and almost the same place, though.
Which actually goes into what you've been saying, that year in itself was a massive wave. And you said through all the country, if anything, probably throughout the world. I don't think they're just regional. If you're seeing UAPs, or, I still like to call them UFOs, California, Ohio, New York, Missouri, I would also think we're just not getting the proper reports from Russia, China, or Europe, for instance.
Yeah, because even in Ohio, it didn't make the news. Well, it made the news for the Coin helicopter encounter, which was a very good encounter during that same period of military. But talking to people, there were people around here that sounded like they'd been abducted too, but nobody talked about it. And they just told me on account of I was doing UFOs, but they didn't want me to say anything.
Now, hang tight for a minute, everybody. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. This is Midnight Frequency Radio with Carl Richardson. I'm your host, Dr. J, filling in. We'll be right back.
This is Dark Spaces News. I'm Joshua Stark. A breakthrough in water technology could help bring clean drinking water to some of the driest places on Earth. Nobel Prize-winning chemist Omar Yaghi has developed an advanced material capable of pulling water directly from the air, even in extremely arid desert environments. The technology uses highly porous structures known as metal organic frameworks, or MOFs, which act like microscopic sponges. These materials capture water vapor from the atmosphere and then release it as liquid water when heated by sunlight. What makes the innovation remarkable is its ability to function where traditional water harvesting methods struggle. Even in regions with very low humidity, the material can extract usable amounts of water without requiring large amounts of energy or complex infrastructure. Researchers believe the technology could eventually provide a reliable source of drinking water for remote communities, disaster-stricken areas, and regions facing severe drought. As climate change continues to strain freshwater supplies around the world, systems based on this material may offer a new way to produce clean water by using one resource available almost everywhere, the air itself. The development presents a significant step toward addressing global water scarcity and could help millions gain access to safe drinking water in the decades ahead. Catch up with us at darkspacesnews.com.
The Bible describes men's thoughts in the last days as deeply corrupted, selfish, and rebellious against God, marked by perilous times. In reverse speech, The Fulfillment of Prophecy, David John Oates goes beyond psychology and linguistics to ask a deeper question. Did Scripture anticipate a time when hidden words would be revealed? Drawing from the Bible, the Gospels, Revelation, and ancient spiritual traditions, this book examines recurring themes long overlooked. The voice of the heart, words that testify against us, secrets proclaimed from the housetops, sealed books opened at the appointed time, and the two-edged sword that proceeds from the mouth. David Oates argues that these are not merely poetic metaphors, but descriptions of a revelatory process now made visible through modern technology. Reverse Speech, Fulfillment of Prophecy, now available at Amazon.com. Get your copy today.
NASA says its TESS telescope has found two of the puffiest planets ever seen, giant worlds about the size of Jupiter, but with only a tiny fraction of Jupiter's mass, making them extremely low density. The planets TOI 791b and TOI 791c orbit a sun-like star about 1,113 light-years away and stand out because scientists did not expect to find such light, bloated worlds at all. TESS spotted them by watching for dips in the star's brightness as the planets passed in front of it. Scientists say the pair is especially unusual because both planets are superpuffs in the same system, and their gravitational tug on each other helped reveal their masses. Researchers now want to learn how these strange planets formed. This is Dark Spaces News. New research suggests younger generations may be aging faster at the biological level, and that shift could be helping drive higher cancer risk in adults under 55. Scientists say the concern is not about how many birthdays people have had, but about how old their bodies appear based on blood markers and other signs of cellular aging. The study compared adults from different birth cohorts and found that more recent generations were more likely to show accelerated biological aging than people born decades earlier. That faster aging was linked to a greater chance of early onset cancers, especially lung, digestive, and uterine cancers. Researchers say the pattern could help explain why some cancers are showing up earlier in life than they used to. The reasons are still being studied, but experts point to a mix of factors including obesity, poorer diets, less physical activity, and lifestyle changes that may be stressing the body sooner. The big takeaway is that biological aging has become a useful warning sign, helping doctors identify people at higher cancer risk before symptoms appear. A personal note: thanks ever so much for everyone who responded to last time's editorial. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your support and continued support at darkspacesnews.com. Catch up with Dark Spaces News on the Dark Spaces News Facebook page and darkspacesnews.com. From Memphis, Tennessee, I'm Joshua Stark.
Join host Carl Richardson as he interviews top guests in various fields of study. Now, airing live every Saturday night from 9 to 11 Central Time and 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern.
Okay, welcome back to the second half of Midnight Frequency Radio, hosted by Carl Richardson. I'm your host, Dr. J, filling in for Carl today. Host of Dr. J Radio Live is my show. We are speaking to the one and only Dr. Irena Scott, who I believe is probably the person on the planet that is the most known and most researched about not just the Pascagoula event, but she's probably one of the largest rising stars in all of abductions and ufology in general. So it is a pleasure to speak to her again. First time for you, audience, for Midnight Frequency. Dr. Scott, welcome back to the second half.
Thank you.
Now, let's go back into Charles and Calvin. So once they're brought inside, and then Calvin, after the regressions years later, recalls that this female is giving him all these, images of diseases, nuclear war and skin melting off, all that bad stuff. What happens after that? Because at some point, obviously, they're brought back on the shore, and then they head to the police or sheriff.
Well, what happened after they were returned from the object is that they both had reactions. They were both terrified when this happened, which anybody would be. Plus, they were not only terrified by what happened, but because they were paralyzed and they could see, they were conscious, but they couldn't move. And that's unusual for abductions, because a lot of times with abductions, people don't even remember. But they were conscious and knew it and remembered it afterwards. Well, they were returned to the pier, and Calvin had some kind of a nervous reaction. I mean, as a physiologist, I was aware of this, but he was standing at the end of the pier, and he had his arms stretched out toward the water. And Charles, he sort of fell down and couldn't get up, and then he got up. But Calvin was still just standing there in a stiff position with his arms stretched out against the water. And I said, I think that's kind of a neural reaction to something. And then Charles kind of got him out of his trance. But then Charles was older, and he had been in the military and with life and death situations. And
I was going to say, with Charles's age, he possibly could have served, was it World War II or Korea that time?
Korea, I think.
Anyway, proceed. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just was curious because
I think it was Korea.
It had to be a real bloody war in that era.
Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of close encounters and deaths. I mean, close encounters with the military. Anyway, he thought that compared to almost getting killed, that he could probably take the harassment of saying that he saw a UFO. Calvin was at a different stage in his life, and he didn't want to go through the rest of his life with everybody harassing him. And, all the nasty things people say to you back then and even now. So Charles wanted to report it, and he thought it was his duty to report it. And Calvin, of course, didn't want to have anything to do with reporting it. But anyway, Charles made the decision to report it, and he had trouble reporting it because he first of all tried a newspaper, and they said, forget about it. Of course, they were closed too. And then he tried to report to the Kessler Air Force Base, and the Air Force had recently concluded Blue Book and said UFOs don't exist. So they said UFOs don't exist. So then he reported to the police, and the police did a really excellent investigation.
One of my favorite things with what the police did, they were skeptical. So they actually left the tape recorder on, left the room to see if they would admit it's a hoax, right?
Yeah, they first of all interviewed him separately, then put them together and interviewed him. Then the interviewer walked out, and they had a hidden tape recorder, and that was because the police didn't want to be made a fool of. They didn't, if these two were hoaxing, they didn't want to look stupid, so they wanted to find out if they were hoaxing. But the tape showed that they were just both practically having a heart attack or a stroke. It had been such a traumatic experience.
For everybody listening, I encourage you after this interview is over to check that. It's available all over. You could find it on YouTube or just Google Calvin Parker, Charles Hickson, police audio, and you will hear it. And literally, you could tell the guys are scared. I believe Charles or Charles says something to the point, I need to have a drink after to calm my nerves. I mean, these guys were really fearful. And again, they didn't know they're being recorded. So this is them being brutally honest to each other and what's happening. So I'm really glad the police did that, especially in that era, because, you know, who knows how they could have spun it, considering the Air Force, that they don't exist, which was just a shame. Now, what happened? You said so the police, once they realized that they were telling the truth and they saw something that scared them, what did they do to investigate?
Well, they actually took him, to doctors, and I interviewed one of the doctors that examined him. And then this was a real good investigation. What was unusual is they remembered what happened. They were conscious when it happened, and they were conscious afterwards. And so a lot of times with the abduction, you don't remember it until 10 years later or something, but they were conscious the whole time. And then they did some more really good investigations. They took him to the Air Force Base and had some top people like colonels and things, doctors and everything else, interview him. And there's still a transcript of that. And then two top scientists that were both university professors, Dr. Alan Hynek, who was the chairman of the Northwestern University Astronomy Department, and Dr. Harder of UCLA, both interviewed him late that weekend and looked over their bodies too for marks. And Philip Mantle found all this material. Plus, there was this thing called the puncture wound document. Mm-hmm. Plus, they had pictures, and he found the pictures too of their bodies, and there was some skin scraping, and maybe one that did look like a puncture wound. But another thing is that they reported their eyes were dilated, and this was several days. This was several days later, and I took a lot of medical stuff in college.
I was going to say, you have a Ph.D. in veterinary science. You know a lot about biology.
Yes, and it said that their eyes were dilated, and this was due to the bright light in the UFO, but the eyes wouldn't be responding to light several days later, and with light, it makes them constrict, not dilate. And so if they were dilating, their eyes were dilated several days later, it suggests that there were some kind of drugs involved, and they both thought that they had been injected.
Now, did any of them find implants in them through x-rays, or because sometimes those puncture wounds are, just punctures, maybe they're drawing something or inserting something, or I don't know what the ETs are analyzing, but other times there seems to be implant placements. Did you know if any of these happened to the two gentlemen?
No, I didn't know about implants, but Calvin, who had the puncture wound, said that he thought his blood had been drained out of him and something else put in.
Which could make sense of why they're dilated days later, because it sounds to me it has to be some chemical or some sort of medicine that causes that reaction, right?
Well, the way they were anesthetized, it's like, I think back in those days when you were anesthetized, they just put you out. But these people, they seemed to be anesthetized, but it was conscious sedation like they use today, where they couldn't move, but their memory and brain was still working. They were still conscious.
I've heard that, from a couple of people, and again, there's no way to prove it, but one of the ways the ETs paralyze you and anesthetize you is by flooding your brain with your opiate receptors, just an opiate dump from what your brain produces. Have you heard anything like that?
I think there's a number of ways to do it now.
Okay, one really major thing that blew my mind from your book and from your research and from our interview the first time was I had no idea, because we know that UFOs are really interested in nuclear weapons. Robert Salas from Malmstrom Air Force Base talks about how they were shut off. Rendlesham partly was the reason we believe that they were the craft showed up over those nights was because it also was storage for nuclear missiles. There were nuclear missiles not far in Missouri, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, that's the new information that came out on my book. Nobody was aware of that at all. And I had talked to several of these people that had experienced, that were in the control rooms when UFOs were over bases and the nuclear missiles were turned off. And that made me think, and I went back over the papers and things and found that actually there was kind of a cover-up. And back in those days, nuclear sites were hidden. The government didn't want people to know that there were particular sites were nuclear sites. And I described one in Ohio that was disguised as a pet food factory called feed materials plant, and actually feed material is high-grade uranium, concentrated uranium. But back then they didn't want people to know about nuclear sites, and you thought nuclear sites might be missiles or like Hanover, things like that. But I discovered that actually they were at a very high-grade nuclear site, and nobody had ever realized it until then. That's basically what my book was about.
Yeah, and that actually fits why there was such a wave there and why so many people saw it, because if they were just coming, for instance, for Calvin and Charles, because they'd been studying them for God knows how long, I would think they're more incognito, but for so many witnesses to see something over a period of time, you mentioned the Coast Guard, even 3 weeks later. And, the other couple, I believe you said her name was Maria. I could be wrong with the husband that eventually said that he was taken. So this just fits more in line with so many other cases we have where people were either contacted, abducted, or people just saw something because they were in a proximity of a nuclear base or missile silo.
Yes, a number of people published, they thought that UFOs, UAP, often appeared near nuclear sites as if possibly there was some kind of interest in them. And in this case, this was just classified as a good old boy backwaters sighting of two people in a pier in Mississippi. But actually, this was a very high-grade nuclear site, and nobody had realized that. And possibly that's why with abductions, usually they take place out in the middle of nowhere and nobody else sees them. There's no way to document them, anything. Well, in this case, a lot of people saw something that was pretty not normal, and enough that even though it was hard to report things back then because of the harassment and because there's no place to report it to, a whole lot of people had reported that night that they saw unusual objects flying around and things. There were just a whole lot of reports. And I thought after this, we should reclassify the site as a nuclear site, like the nuclear missile sites and things like that, instead of just, a Southern good old boy sighting.
Back when we were earlier in this interview, when we were mentioning the observables, one thing that I didn't think to mention, and it popped in my mind because I saw Disclosure Day not too long ago, was the screen memories that ETs use. And you also wrote in your book about the post-hypnotic suggestions that they possibly give. And a third thing, which can possibly tied to one thing, would be the post-hypnotic suggestions. The other thing would be the idea that these UAPs can actually read our thoughts. For instance, the David Fravor incident, when he saw the Tic Tac, the UFO or the Tic Tac is eventually went to his classified cat point. Is that what it's called? So in your research, you've seen other instances of this happen, right? Where they're inserting screen memories or post-hypnotic suggestions or even responding to our thoughts in real time and possibly 30 seconds ahead of us.
Yes, like the airplane pilot, he said that just in seconds that this thing knew where the cat point was and went. Well, it was like Maria Blair described. She said that her husband decided to put his clothes in the ship, and just like that, this UFO was there, just in seconds. And it's like they can kind of read your mind. But I was saying that this is very, very dangerous. I mean, like Bob Salas, who reported the UFO and the missiles, both of those people said that it's dangerous to turn off the missiles and things. But I was saying it's just as dangerous to have metal effects, such as abductions, at a nuclear site.
That begs the question, do you think that sometimes the beings that people are seeing are screen memories to disguise them as something more familiar? I guess the better way to phrase this, so many people talk about gray aliens, and gray aliens are in media everywhere. Is it possible that some of these abductions are beings, for instance, like the type that Calvin saw, or even uglier than that, but they show themselves as grays as a little familiarity? This is just a hypothesis, but what would you say? Do you think that happens?
Well, in my abduction observables, a lot of people have screen memories, and they don't just see grays, they see animals and things like that are familiar. But it'll turn out later that these are entities, whatever they are, that can have screen memories. And there's a number of things that often turn up like owls. People see owls, and then later they find out that they're UFO aliens. And they'll have screen memories of something happened that just seems a little bit out of shape or things, and then later they will, under hypnosis or in other ways, they will realize that this was they were interacting with aliens, but it was disguised in their memory. Like this one woman, Betty Andreessen, when she was a kid, she dreamed that this bee came up and stung her. And actually, what she remembered on hypnosis, it wasn't a bee, it was a little orb, and it came and hit her right in the forehead instead of being a bee, which she remembered, and that sort of thing, that you'll disguise it in your memory. And so the aliens or whatever take different appearances. They may look like an animal or just something familiar instead of aliens, whatever aliens look like.
There we go. Okay, I was saying in the movie Disclosure Day, I think we caught that part already, how they were using, Steven Spielberg was using things like foxes, deer, and even birds to show up as screens, as something familiar, when in reality it was those gray aliens.
Yeah, it was some kind of entity that were taking, people would see like a common animal instead of whatever an alien looks like.
Now, outside of the couple that had the 3 hours missing time, and essentially the husband, before placed on the ventilator, mentioned that they were abducted, and outside Calvin and Charles, anybody else on the 1973 nights that was also abducted?
I think there were abductions in other places, such as the people I talked to around here that nobody would talk about, to anybody, except they told me. But yeah, I think that same night, I interviewed a number of people before I found out about the abduction of these two. And I recorded things that caused me to think there might have been more abductions than that. but at that time, I didn't have any idea there might have been more abductions, so I didn't really go into it. But like people would say they were going away from UFOs and hiding someplace, and then they would see the UFO in a place where they saw it earlier, which to me suggested missing time. And there were several people that I thought might have also been abducted that time, with the screen memories and everything, that wouldn't know it.
This is obviously just purely it's pure speculation that I'm going to ask you, but do you have any idea why they're abducting people?
Well, that was one thing I was sort of covering in my abduction observables. There's a formal abduction, which is just a regular abduction. They take a person and do something and release the person. That's like humans do. But there were a whole lot of other things that I was talking about that often are reported during abductions that nobody pays attention to. And these are often, there's a bright light, the object just suddenly appears. It doesn't seem that, I'm like an airplane, it takes off and then it flies and then it goes someplace. Well, the UFOs seem to just appear and disappear, and they don't travel like an airplane. There's usually often a close encounter. And one thing that really you pay attention to is that physics, the principles of physics seem to not operate during abductions. That seems more disturbing to me than the abduction, because the objects seem to levitate, the entities seem to levitate, and people seem to levitate. And often in abductions, people just go through walls and things like that just aren't in our type of physics at all. And it's not just like an abduction, it's like something else is going on besides that there's a whole change in the physics or the scientific environment or something.
I don't know if you recall what I told you last time. There's this case that came out of Preston Dennett's book, UFOs Over California. And a woman is an abductee, and she recalls the night before that she was also taken, but her 7-year-old son was on board. And the next morning at breakfast, she's wondering if he remembers it. So she doesn't want to say, did you see aliens or anything? She said, how'd you sleep last night? And he goes, good, mommy. And then she's like, phew, he doesn't remember. And then all of a sudden he goes, but my alien friends came back to visit me with a big smile. And she's thinking, oh my God, he remembers. And then this is the part that gets crazy. The kid says, but they get mad at me. And she said, why? He said, because when they walk him through the walls, he stops to look at all the colored balls. And they tell him it's dangerous to stay there. What that tells me, using a 7-year-old terms, he is being literally walked through a wall. And as the wall dematerializes in front of him, he is literally seeing molecules on the atomic level in different colors. That's what it sounds like to me. So I have always wondered, is it technology that's making them do this? Or are they literally able to manipulate physics with their mind?
Well, that's what I wondered, because it's like the quantum theory. It's like quantum mechanics. I mean, people don't understand anything about that. And like light can be either a vibration or a particle. And people don't understand how it can be either that or that under some circumstances. Well, I was just comparing that to UFOs. I mean, they can just materialize out of nowhere, like becoming a particle, and then disappear to us, to our level of understanding. And it seems to me like it involves something a lot more complicated than just, reaching out and abducting something. It's like a whole change in your physics.
It really is. And that's something that I really hope we get answers to. It really bothers me. I understand why they're hiding the technology, but they don't have to hide the beings and the truth from us. At least they could just show us, a body or, one that didn't survive, or a living one. Bring them on TV for us to interview. I just still don't understand what is classified about that. And so I guess this brings me to the next question. With all these hearings that are going on, do you have any optimism that we'll ever get the truth?
Well, I also worry about whether they get the truth from us, but I also worry about whether the government may be mentally influenced by the entities too, or whatever they are, that maybe there's something up in the government from UFOs that are influencing the top of the government or something. And I worry about that a little bit too. I don't know. I guess the reason they thought one reason it became the subject became classified was because when it started, they didn't know whether UAP or UFOs were aliens or from another country. And so they wanted to keep everything that they knew classified so the other country wouldn't know. And if they found out how to make weapons or things, they would want to, stay in advance of the other countries and things like that. So they don't want the other countries to know about it. So, but I think if they had the same ability as the UFOs, if our government had the same capabilities of UFOs, well, we'd just take over the world in no time. So I'm not too sure how much we know about them for sure.
Well, and obviously some of these crash and retrievals produced bodies. So at some point they had to realize, wait a minute, these aren't genetically modified humans as some people, have said in the past. Clearly they're something else. If you could brief one person.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. We obviously had some audio issues earlier with equipment, and it's almost like there's another party out there that wants this to be ruined, but we're not going to let that happen. If there's one person that you had the chance anywhere on this planet, any country, king, queen, scientist, president, who would be the one person that you would brief on all the findings in your book, Pascagoula, the Ultimate Close to UFO Encounters?
I don't know, because it'd have to be a scientist, I think, on account of the credibility. I think if I brief somebody, it would be people in general, because people are who experiences a lot of this, and they don't know what's going on. Nobody does, and I just don't know.
Well, you're doing a great service to humanity by researching and publishing your books, because a lot of people who have, these close encounters of the third, fourth kind really are always looking for answers, and a lot of them are very traumatized. I've noticed that. With regards to Pascagoula, what is the one piece of evidence that you have in the book that you wrote that you would give to any person who's a skeptic that doesn't necessarily believe in UFOs or abductions, that you think would be a game changer that would, change their perception of what's really happening?
Well, I think the number of witnesses would be a good, you can't really prove the witnesses truthful, and I'll get attacked and say, well, all these people are lying. I don't think they are lying. I think most of them seem very sincere to me. The large number of witnesses, and also at the time of the event, the police recorded maybe about 50 phone calls that night, and from people reporting something was flying around. They saw a strange object. And that was before it made the news or anything. So they weren't influenced by the news. They were influenced by seeing something that they had never seen before. And it was strong enough to overcome the fact that they'd be ridiculed and that there was no place to report to. That quite a few people that night, like maybe 50 people, reported seeing something. So, they say, abductions aren't real, and because there's no documentation, all that. Well, in this case, there was a whole lot of documentation.
like you said, the people that you spoke to are sincere, and those are just the people that reported it. I'm sure there's countless people that have either passed or never talked about it for a ridicule factor that also saw it. And you have all these people who don't necessarily know each other telling the same thing. To me, that's even more credible.
Yeah, because they were. It was like, and even that night. Some distance away along the freeway and things, there were people that were reporting some really strange things. Like about 50 miles away, there were these three men. One of them was kind of famous, in a car traveling toward New Orleans. And they said that that this was the same night that some object came over them, then a smaller object came down and got in front of their car as they were driving along, and it was sort of clicking, and it's just like the scanner that Charles and Kelvin reported. It was in front of their cars. They were driving along, and they were hypnotized, and just like Kelvin and Charles reported, it was like they were paralyzed. It was like they were in a trance, and they just were traveling along with this thing in front of them. Then it disappeared some way, and they came out of a trance and said, "What happened?" And this was like 100 miles away at the same time. And I guess for my own experience, I thought my mother was a little bit off that same night too.
I've always found it fascinating, and this goes to what we were talking about earlier. Is it technology, or are they just so advanced with their brains that they're able to put people in the trance? That's a question I'm always going to have, and I hope one day we can get the answer. Is it them biologically that's able to paralyze us, put screen memories in us, and essentially calm us and control us and get us to do what they want? Or is it some facet of their craft or other, artifacts or technology on that? With that being said, Dr. Scott, we are running out of time. So I do want to say, if there's a final statement about your book, about ufology, that you would like to tell the audience, or if there's anything we missed. Of course, there's more. I'm sure I'll have you back on my show. Carl will want you back on his show as well. So more interviews to come. But with regards to today's, is there anything else that you feel we should cover?
Yes, I think the idea that you can be mentally influenced by these things, and that this is taking place on a nuclear site, and nuclear sites, missiles and things, you can destroy the world with this. I mean, like the United States can kill everybody in the world. You can just destroy the world. So it seems to me like they don't take abduction serious, or UFOs. What it seems to me like, with that many witnesses, something was going on, plus the abduction, plus other mental effects, that this was by a nuclear site. And it seems pretty dangerous, and it seems like people ought to pay attention to that. The government ought to pay a whole lot of attention to it, in my opinion.
I totally agree, and people underestimate the amount of abductions there are. In the 90s, Gallup poll said that 1 in 40 people were probably taken at some point in their lives. So with everything you said, the ability to, just messing with these nuclear weapons, and one goes off, they are far more powerful today than they were in 1945. So that's always a concern. Real quick, let's talk about where people can buy your book, Pascagoula, The Ultimate Close UFO Encounter, the Best Documented Nuclear Government and Mind Control Dimensions.
It's on Amazon.com, and it's also on Flying Disc Press. And I have a website, just irenascott.com, Irena Scott, one word. And on my website, you can just click on it, and it goes to the Amazon.com, and I think the Flying Disc Press website does too. Or else just look under my name in Amazon.com, Irena McCammon Scott, or the name of my book, and it should show up on Amazon.com.
And we will definitely incorporate all those links, your website, where to buy the book. I'll have Carl put that up. And remember, everybody, Carl is away tonight. This is Dr. J, host of Dr. J Radio Live, filling in for Midnight Frequency. Be sure to check out my YouTube channel. There are hundreds of interviews, somewhere between 500 and 600, with virtually everybody you can imagine, from the sixth man on the moon, Edgar Mitchell, to Stanton Friedman, Whitley Strieber, whoever you could think of. Chances are I've interviewed him in the last 14 years. Even Art Bell was an interview. So with that being said, everybody, thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for this interview. Carl will be joining you again next week, and we'll all catch you on the flip side.